Catherine, nice to meet you. Kids been together for a while. I didn't mean to get you. Well, you know, congratulations. That's fine. Who's his kidney doctor?
It's over there.
Freeman? Leave the great house, Dr. Freeman.
I can get somebody to
Well, as a female, there's Freeman on the second
All right, good evening, everyone. Glad you all are back this evening as we continue our study in the Gospel of John. I don't know how your weekly rhythm has been, but we are just 2 weeks away from a spring break, whether you get one or not. 2 weeks away from a spring break here in this class. I'm looking forward to the weather of spring. We need to remind, like the weatherman, that's what it's supposed to be. That said, we are going to be over the next couple sessions tonight and next week in some fairly familiar content because Mark has been preaching on this content. And so we can move through it, not necessarily quickly, but with familiarity. So I want to recognize that. We are in John chapter 9 this evening as we get started, and we have the healing of the blind man, or the man who was born blind. By way of review, we don't need to do this for very long because we've actually had meetings. We've been meeting on a regular basis at least the last 2 weeks. We are in the middle of a section, chapters 5 through 10, where Jesus has been attending festivals, Jewish feasts down in Jerusalem. And the last feast that we were a part of was started in John chapter 7, goes all the way through chapter 9, and we're going to start tonight with the question, are we still at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles? Okay, so if you can kind of look at the review there on your handout, this is fall, about a year, 9 months or so, about a year before the death of Jesus. We're going to get all the way to the Feast of Dedication. We know it better as Hanukkah this evening. And we're going to therefore be about 4 months, 3-4 months. If Jesus dies in AD 33, the date would be April 3rd, AD 33. And we're going to be in late December by our accounting of dates. So we're going to get ourselves rather close to then the passion narrative or the death of Jesus. We may be able to touch our toes a bit in the story of the raising of Lazarus. I know that that's the sermon from this Sunday. It depends on kind of the pace and how fast that we go. So let me start then with kind of this question in the narrative that we don't know the answer to. But it's important for us to be able to kind of just go along. In John chapter 9, it starts out with this little phrase, as he passed by. Now in context, remember John didn't write his gospel with chapter breaks. So if you're reading this along the story, the verse right before that in John 8:59 says, they picked up stones to throw at Jesus, at him, but Jesus hid himself and then went out of the temple. So that's the end of our story last week. He's running away, he's hiding himself, and not running away out of fear, but out of my time is not yet here. He hides himself, leaves the temple, and as he passed by. So you have two groups of scholars. One group of scholars, I tend to agree with them, says this is still the same day. Jesus has hidden, slipped out of the temple, and he encounters someone, and he has this moment, this story with this individual. Now, ironically, this story then becomes a judgment of the people who just tried to judge Jesus and stone him. This story becomes that paradigm that says you're blind and he sees. So if I'm right, this story happens right after that, the same day. It would be therefore the last day of the Festival of Tabernacles. They started the Festival of Tabernacles with parades, parade of lights. We're going to follow God like we followed him in the wilderness. A parade of water. He is the living water. He gives us everything that we need. We've talked about those dynamics. And so John chapter 9 is an extended discourse. Now other scholars would say, well, maybe this is just a week or two later. I don't know that it matters a ton, but in the narrative context, it does seem to be that it takes place right there. This story is also important because it's the 6th of 7 signs. So notice a little bit at the end of your handout, the highlight. They printed it in color, which is great. Notice that this is kind of moving John's gospel along. We're at number 6. And number 7 is kind of the ta-da moment in John's gospel. To my students, I call it the hinge in John's gospel, or the watershed in John's gospel. When Lazarus is raised from the dead, the Jewish leaders know that they need to do something with Jesus. Now, they've already been trying to stone him, so it's not like they're changing their mind. But there's resolve in them. Because everyone is going to Jesus and believing, and they're like, something has to be done. And they want to kill Jesus, and they want to kill Lazarus. So this is still building up to some of that tension that's taking place. I also want you to remember that one of the things that happened at the Feast of Tabernacles, this is that bullet point under context number 1, was that Jesus used this phrase in chapter 8, verse 12. I am the light of the world. That menorah, that lampstand that you parade behind, that's me. I'm God. When you follow me, you follow my Father. You follow God. I'm the light of the world. We're going to see that same phrase in chapter 9, verse 5. It's another reason why I argue this is a continuation of the narrative from the Feast of Tabernacles. Multiple themes. So then in John's gospel, you have the theme of light and darkness. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and he created what? Light and order out of darkness and chaos. The parable of the blind man is not just, the story of the healing of the blind man is not just a story. It is a historical story. I believe that. Historical story, he healed a blind man. I also believe there are parabolic dynamics to it. What do I mean by that? The miracle means more than just what happened. There's a sign to it. So when Jesus multiplies bread and feeds 5,000, did he feed them? Yes, he fed them. Were they filled? Yes, they were filled. Did it mean something deeper? Yes, it meant something deeper. You can go through all 7 of these signs, and in John's gospel, understand that not only is he saying, hey, here's something that happened, but this shows you something about the nature of Jesus and the nature of his kingdom and the nature of heaven out there. So we could kind of back up and go, water to wine, a wedding. There's going to be a celebration day. There's going to be a feast. And Jesus is bringing about the wedding, the great wedding. And we could do that for each of these as we walk through. So the healing of the blind man is one of those stories where we find this deeper meaning. And it's going to be pretty clear. All right, I know I went out of order. Bullet point number 2, under context. The word translated division. I put the Greek word there for a couple of you who are curious about Greek words the other day. This word is where we get our word schism, right? So it's division. But this has actually been a theme during the entire Feast of Tabernacles. So John 7:43, John 19:16 in this text, all the way to the end of our time together tonight, John 10:19, 3 times it's going to use this same word. They were divided over Jesus. They were divided over Jesus. They were divided over Jesus. So here's my question for your table. First question. What divides people over Jesus in your world today? Go. Yeah, what divides people over Jesus today? Or how does Jesus divide people today? I decided I'd get out the whiteboard. So what are some of your immediate answers? What are some things about Jesus that divides people over him? Okay, so his identity. Can I use that word? His identity. This is true then. Who is he? Is he a prophet? Is he just a teacher? Is he a rebellious leader? Who is this Jesus? Okay, so the identity of Jesus. What are some other things that divide people about Jesus? Okay, yeah, so the activities of Jesus, identity, activity might be like what is historical? What really happened? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? The reason why we want to move through John really kind of 7, 8, 9, and 10 because of snow days rather quickly, I really want to land one evening just on the evidence for the authentic historical resurrection of Jesus. Because I think when it comes to conversations, that's important, but also just when it comes to our own faith, we have evidence for the resurrection. And John, that's his purpose, is to give you some of that evidence as an eyewitness, let alone the other gospels. So great, over his activity. Did he really do these things? Ironically, first century historians didn't have much of a problem saying, oh yeah, Jesus did miracles and healed people and healed people who were possessed. That was just kind of a common thing that everyone knew about Jesus. And so there's just some intriguing things about that, and we'll come to the resurrection and go, if it happened, I believe it did, it changes everything. You ought to believe the guy who raises from the dead, that he might know what he's talking about. He might know something about not just life, but also life after death, or how to achieve life or get life from the Father. Okay? So what else about Jesus then divided people? Okay, good. Yeah, that's actually right on target with what I was thinking. Here's the 3 words. I didn't put them in your handout, but these would be the 3 words: the identity of Jesus, the activity of Jesus, and the authority of Jesus. So the identity of Jesus, the activity of Jesus, and the authority of Jesus. Because the Pharisees weren't all that keen on Jesus' authority, nor were the Sadducees or the high priestly family, because he was threatening their authority. If it's the high priestly family and the Sadducees, their authority is in Jerusalem and the temple. So think about power units or power structures. We use that language. They didn't. But the high priestly family, Sadducees, aristocrats, wealthy, political elites, Jerusalem. You can kind of think of capitals of countries, right? They all gather around those areas. That's Jerusalem. Pharisees, not wealthy aristocrats, but do have teaching authority, right? Influence and authority over local people. They're more blue-collar scholars, and they have authority typically in synagogues or in legal disputes, so scribes and Pharisees. So authority, Jesus threatens both of those. Does he threaten authority in the synagogue? Sure he does. He goes in there and teaches and heals people on the Sabbath, threatens the authority of the Pharisees. He goes into the temple and cleanses the temple and chases out the money changers. He's an equal opportunity offender for the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Okay, so he definitely threatens authority. So I want you to see this, that he is dividing at the same time as bringing people together. Jesus says, I didn't just come to bring peace, also a sword. Some families, he mentions a family of 5, will be divided over me. 3 people will go one way, 2 people will go another way. And some of you have families where that has been true. And I know families, sometimes who have a different culture or religious background, who literally will take the life of a loved one because they become a Christ follower. So we have a dynamic here where we recognize not only is this true in context, Jesus is going to bring not only peace and life, but people are going to be divided over it. And so it's very much an applicable or modern day phenomenon we see as well. One other thing I want to point out, this is on then your second page, so the back of that first page, is that this is an intriguing story in the sense that it feels like we've heard this story a bit before. Not a blind man, but a man who was lame, a man who was healed at another pool. This pool would be on the other side of the temple. So if this is the temple... Oh, this marker's not working. All right, if this was the temple, let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay, so if this was the temple, the first man is healed in a pool that's approximately over here, and the other man, my map's not going to be to scale, the other man's going to be on the other side of the temple. So one of the things that's intriguing is the guy who's healed in John 5 and the guy who's healed in John 9 have some similarities, but also some differences. In fact, what we see, and there's a scholar, his name is Kostenberger, Andreas Kostenberger. I mentioned his name in the last bullet point there. He points out that there seems to be like some progression in the sign stories. In other words, that at first there was some confusion, but even rejection, even on behalf of the guy in John 5. This jerk gets Jesus in trouble in John 5. Whereas this guy, the guy in John 9, comes to a place of belief. So there's some contrasts and some growth in those two contrasting stories. But both are on the Sabbath, both cause a conflict over the Sabbath with the Jewish leaders. This man in John 9 seems to be the paradigm of saying, if Jesus is going to bring healing into your life, this is how you respond. Whereas John 5, Jesus says, don't sin or something worse might happen to you. It kind of gives him a warning. So I find that intriguing. Not a huge deal, but worth mentioning when it comes to the progression of John's story. Now, here's where another question that I want to cause us to have a conversation about at our table. Let's go ahead and look at the text again, John 9. As he passed by, whether he's coming out of the temple, kind of in the shadows as they tried to stone him, there was a man blind from birth. Notice Jesus saw him. Can you notice the irony of this? I want you to start to trace in this story how many times people see things or assume that someone saw something. Okay, so start to notice either the word or the theme, see or saw or look. He passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, teacher, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was, notice what they're assuming, that he was born blind? Now in Mark's sermon, we talked about this a bit, but here's this question. Does sin bring consequences? Well, we can come at this multiple times. Can we ask this question? Does sin bring ailments? I want you to, at your tables, it's not a simple answer, but does sin bring consequences like physical ailments? The answer might be yeah. Okay, but I want you to discuss that again, just like 30, 60 seconds. Does sin bring physical ailments or consequences?
I think it's probably sometimes true, but not always. But yeah, definitely. To get forgiveness, I'm willing to keep sinning because we still have to have consequences of what we want to try. That's why, if he takes away the sin, why doesn't he take away the consequence? Take away the penalty, why does he take away the consequence?
Okay, I'm going to change the question. Change the question. Are all ailments, I'm using the word ailments to kind of generalize, are all ailments the result of personal sin? In other words, I'm sick because I or someone close to me sinned. Yes, I give you the answer. Don't cheat. But I give you the answer, right? Are all ailments the result of personal sin? Why or why not? Go. I heard no, and that's it.
He absolutely knows not, because Jesus is the reason.
I just no, and we're moving on, all right? Can I change the question? I know I frustrate some of you. You're like, I just started talking. Are all ailments the result of sin, though? I took out the word personal. Are all ailments the result of sin? General. Okay, so yes. Last question's on the handout. Okay, last question, not for the night, but for right now. Okay. Can God's power be displayed in all ailments and weaknesses, regardless of whether they're caused by personal sin or just generalized because we live in a broken world? The answer is yes. Okay. So I then need to make it personal because those are easy answers. Here's my personal question. You don't have to answer. How can God use your headline of pain to bring him glory and other people to know him more? That makes it more personal, doesn't it? How can God use your trials and tribulations as a platform to showcase the good news of the gospel? Now that's a little bit more of a discussion question. I'm going to give you a little bit more time. Go. How can God use your trials and tribulations to be a platform to showcase the gospel?
Can't have a testimony unless you've had a test. Yeah. It isn't necessary. But it helps when you say, I know how you feel. You really do, right?
One of the things I think we are called to wrestle with in our personal discipleship is this reality that this side of heaven we will suffer, and that we won't always know if that suffering, if that dot can be connected to like a consequence or personal sin, or just in general, this is a broken world. Not always can we connect those dots. Can we just acknowledge that? Now, in my pastoral ministry a long time ago, when I was a minister at Carterville Christian Church, this is like 2001 or 2, a long time ago. Yeah. 2001 or 2, I'm 21, 22 years old. There's a couple in our church. They're good friends of ours. And they, sorry if this is a pain trigger, but they lost a child. And one of the things they were processing in their grief was like this same question of like, is this something we did? Same question the disciples are questioning. Or was this just that there is grief in this world and loss in this world? And one of the things, they actually connected this dot of like, well, we're not very good at like managing our resources, our money, and maybe God knew that we weren't ready for a family because of that. And I remember just as a young leader going, oh, okay, so this is one of those texts that I would go to go, is God sovereign? Does he allow it? There's some tension even in that language. Understand some of that tension. I think you want to use the word mystery. Sometimes we won't know the reason of our suffering until the other side of it. Now, this man has an other side of it in his lifetime. Some of you will have an other side of it, the suffering in your lifetime, where you go, oh God, whether this was caused by you, caused by consequences, or just the consequence of a broken world, I don't know. It's a mystery. But I see how you used it for your glory. I could talk about things like pains in my own life. I allude to sometimes, hey, I have family, parents went through divorce. I learned rather quickly as a college student, God can use that for good. As I counsel other peers when I was in college, Does that counsel other couples, even other couples with kids who are going through divorce? Like, I recognize that God can use that as a platform to bring about his goodness in ministry, that somehow he can recycle. Can I use this language? God can recycle grief and pain and trials. God can recycle that and make it something that's beautiful and new. We believe that, resurrection out of death. So do we believe that when we're in it? That's the hard thing. And so here's this man, and he's blind from birth. I mean, he's been in this for a long time. And so notice Jesus is going to talk about, verse 4, we must work the works of him who sent me while it's still day. Night is coming when no one can work. Sometimes I don't know all that Jesus means, but I do find this interesting. He uses this language of work. Guess what day it is? It's Sabbath, okay? So he's using the language of work. It's going to continue to get him in trouble, although there's no one around to hear him at this particular moment. But he's using this language of God working in this. And so having said these things, I don't know how Jesus spit on the ground. Mark really didn't get into like the details of this. We can do it a little bit tonight. I don't know how you envision Jesus spitting, okay? He's, I don't know, from blue-collar Galilee with a bunch of fishermen. Is it one of those kinds of spits? Right? They're like, okay. And, you know, your mom would be embarrassed kind of a spit. I don't know. Like, is it just like a little dribble of spit? I don't know. But I do actually, like this, I'm not going to, like this microphone will amplify anything I do. I'm not going to do that. But I do have some, like, why spit? Right? I have some questions. Mark kind of, in a good way, moved through this with saying, one of the things that we pick up from this is Jesus is coming to bring a new creation. What is broken is being redeemed and remade. And so you kind of picture the one who is the potter, who made us, right, the pots, using this mud to kind of refashion, this symbolic refashioning. We were created out of dirt, this recreation of this man. That seems to be a nuance, especially in John, where everything has a deeper meaning. But I also want us to recognize this. In the first century world, scholars will point out, spit was seen to have medicinal values. Now, we might look at that and say, that's stupid. I'm guessing 100 years from now, they'll look at radiation therapy for those who have cancer and be like, what were y'all doing? Okay. Same way we look at leaching, although I heard that's maybe coming back. Okay. Just saying, no thanks, I'm good, right? And so there are like medicinal, traditions and theories that have happened throughout time. So some scholars say, well, Jesus used what was contemporary for them that would have been recognizable as a sign or act of healing, right? So does Jesus do this at times? Well, yeah, sure he does. I mean, he touches the leper and he says, go to the priest and wash. That was a contemporary way for a leper to deal with their leprosy. So maybe he is also then doing that there's a surface meaning, and then there's this deeper meaning that Mark alluded to in his sermon. The real answer is I don't really know, but there seems to be kind of both and of those two things going on here in this particular moment. There's other times where Jesus will actually like just spit on a blind guy's eyes, like not even make the mud, just be like, I don't know. In his, I just don't know how it happened, right? And so there is something that's happening with that saliva or that image. Now, you know this, that blood also has a similar kind of like significance. It's not just blood, but it's also blood. It's life. When it drains out of you, life comes out of you. So my hunch is that medicinal, yes, new creation, yes, and somewhere in the middle is this idea that the life, I don't want to use the word life force because you think Star Wars, but the life of Jesus is being transferred from this one man to the other. Now we say the same thing about the blood of Jesus, right? We're washed in his blood. So some scholars would say it may be even all three of those things that's taking place in this awkward scene to us of Jesus spitting, making mud, and putting it on this man's eyes. Again, later on, we're going to be like, you put a Band-Aid? Why did you use that chemical compound or whatever that we'll discover later is terrible for us, okay? So that is, a dynamic that we want to recognize. He anoints him, and then he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. This sounds like an Old Testament story, right? You want to be healed? Okay, go wash in the pool of Siloam. Can I just pause here a second and go, this is kind of funny. Jesus is encountering a blind man. Puts mud on him. He's not healed yet. And he says, hey, go find the pool of Siloam. Okay, do you find any humor in that at all? I hope you find some humor in that, right? I don't know how far. It's about a half mile away from the temple. If they're around the temple still, Jesus slipped out of the temple in the last section. So it's, go walk a half mile and find this pool. Now, like the father who left the city of Capernaum to go all the way to the city of Cana, 20 miles, And then Jesus said, hey, go back. Your son's going to be healed. He had to leave and walk. And the entire time, only halfway, until he encountered people that your son was healed. When did that happen? About the same time. Wow. This guy still has to have faith to leave, to go wash. Now, historically, we could dive into this a ton. We won't dive into it a lot. You could Google the Pool of Siloam, and you could pull it up. It's a pool. I've been in it. I've washed in that, walked in that pool. It's actually continually being uncovered, and the archaeological dig is kind of expanding around this pool. The stairs, the terraces around this pool are being expanded. It's at the end of what we call Hezekiah's Tunnel, which is about a little bit over 500-yard tunnel underground, about as wide as my shoulders are broad, and sometimes a little taller than 6 foot, maybe 8 foot, but sometimes a little less, about 5 foot. And over that, I was talking to Dan McGrew about this, over that 500 yards, this is carved out in the 6th, 7th century BC, over 500 yards, there's only a 12-inch difference in elevation so that the water can run. There's evidence in the tunnel. When you get midway through the tunnel, you can see where the two groups of people who were carving this tunnel, where they met, because there's just a little bit of an angle difference. And you can see that one overshot just a bit. So the tunnel's kind of like that, just for 6 inches, 12 inches in that tunnel. I just need you to recognize how amazing that is. And technology is one of those things we like to be boastful about. But we were talking about the temple or the pyramids or some of their engineering. It's pretty amazing to not have the technology we have, to go 500 yards in solid rock, have a 12-inch drop so that the water runs into the city from the spring, and to meet underground at exactly the same spot. It's intriguing to me. And we see engineering like that all over the place. This is an example of what C.S. Lewis would warn us against, which is what I would call chronological snobbery. Okay, you can kind of picture it in his British accent. I don't know how British his accent was, but chronological snobbery, this idea that we're smarter than people before us. You realize that's connected to theories of evolution and all of that. Okay, so just recognize that worldview is actually an erroneous worldview. So this pool is, you can go there. Historically, it's there, and it's one of those places where people washed and found water. So there's significance of that. This is also Feast of Tabernacles, where they took the water out with the pitcher, the golden pitcher, and paraded around saying God is the one who gives us water of life. So now we have two connections to the Feast of Tabernacles. So connection number one, I'm the light of the world. Connection number two, this pool. I think it's the same holiday week, and this is taking place in that particular context. So we have light and darkness, night and day. With that taking place, then he went, he washed, he came back seeing. Notice when he comes back, there are going to be neighbors. Some of you have these kinds of neighbors. The neighbors and those who had seen him. Notice the word seen him. Those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, it is him, or it is he. And others said, no, it just looks like him. But he kept saying, I'm that guy. I'm the dude. I'm the same guy. Again, there's some humor in this story, right? They can't see it. They're like, who is it? Well, he's born blind. I think you get some of this disbelief and belief with what your eyes are beholding. So they said to him, then how were your eyes opened? He answered, of course, a man named Jesus anointed me. Retells the story. I was sent to the pool called Siloam, which means sent to wash. I think John here is kind of winking at you. He was sent to the pool called Sent to wash, and then he's going to be sent. And there's just kind of this overtone of that idea of being sent by Jesus and obeying. So I went and I washed, I recovered my sight. They said to him, where is he? This is the funniest question in the story. Okay. Guy born blind. Can you rewind? You know he was born blind. You're his neighbor. You've seen him begging every day. He just told you a story. You're that guy. I'm the guy. Jesus, this guy came and he healed me. He sent me to the pool first, and then when I washed, then I could see. Well, where's Jesus at? I was blind. That's his answer, right? I don't know where he went. I was kind of just trying to find the pool. And so there's a little bit of humor in this story. I don't know if you find it funny or not, but I do. So that's good. All right. So I don't know. And then they brought him, these neighbors, they brought him to the Pharisees. Okay, this man who is blind. And then, dun, 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 verse 14, it was a Sabbath day. When Jesus made the mud, he worked, and he opened his eyes. So the Pharisees asked him how he received his sight, and he told the story yet again a second time. And so verse 16, the end, there was division among them about Jesus. Okay, so what I want you to notice is a couple things. Number one, you're going to notice that John 9 looks like a trial from this part on. That it looks like the blind man is on trial. The neighbors made the accusation. They brought him to the authorities. We're now going to have a court case. And there's going to be multiple people called to the court case. The parents are going to be called to court. The man's going to be called to court. Jesus is going to be called to court. Right? So we're going to have eyewitness, notice the irony of this, eyewitness testimony of multiple people in this court case. The court case is going to be over. Jesus not only working on the Sabbath, but was this man blind or was this man not blind? And what do we do with him and his family? Same thing with Lazarus in chapter 11. Now we got to kill him because Jesus brought him back from the dead, so we got to make him deader again. So we got to undo Jesus. Okay, notice how people are always trying to react to Jesus, sometimes in very foolish ways. Okay, so sometimes our rejection of Jesus causes us to have foolish reactions. This is oftentimes the case. The Jewish people, the Jewish leaders will at times say, Jesus, you're breaking the Sabbath. Then they'll go have a meeting and talk about how to deal with Jesus. They'll go to work and talk about how to deal with Jesus, and they'll talk about how to destroy him. Jesus is like, I just said the Sabbath is for rest and healing. I brought healing to this person, and now you're going to work to talk about how to bring death and destroy someone. Do you recognize the irony of that? So this is another one of those kinds of stories. And so notice that we have not just the sign, but now we have the trial, and these neighbors are bringing. Then we have this kind of other dynamic. I pointed out, I'm trying to think of where that's at. Oh, the progression of the man who was born blind. Mark said this in his sermon, so I'm going to allude to it, move on. Notice how he sees in progression, and then he's fully healed. Kind of like the go to the pool of scent and wash, and then you'll see, and then he sees. There's this discipleship journey of seeing. Mud all the way to the pool of seeing. So he's the man Jesus, chapter 8, verse 11. It's 9:11. He's the prophet Jesus, 9:17. And then he calls him Lord. He believes, and dun dun dun, in John's gospel, when you worship, you only worship as a Jewish individual God. You don't worship people. The Romans might get away with that. The Greeks might get away with that. If you're Jewish, you don't worship anyone but God alone. So what does he believe about Jesus as Lord? He believes he's God. So don't miss that an act of worship is a statement of what you believe when it comes to the nature of Jesus. So we have this progression that takes place. When it comes to the Pharisees, they call the blind man, they call the parents in front, they call the blind man again in front, and we have this stage of questioning. I don't know that we need to walk through all of those details, but I do want you to see that there's a threat of verdict in this trial. And so like all trials, there's a consensus of here's what we're going to do. And the verdict is kind of this dual verdict. For the parents, they're afraid that they're going to be kicked out of the synagogue. This not only has social implications for them, or ramifications, this also has economic ramifications to them. So they plead the fifth. That's anachronistic, but they plead the fifth and say, he's old enough, he's of age, you ask him. But this is the threat, this is the verdict that's going to take place. And yet notice, like a good shepherd, we'll get there in a bit, this man who is blind, who's going to get kicked out, is going to be sought out by Jesus as the good shepherd. So one of the things that I find very intriguing is that dynamic that takes place. I believe it's down in verse 34. They cast him out. They cast him out. Can you kind of hear the verdict? The court case has been heard. You're no longer part of us, part of the synagogue. Jesus, verse 35, heard they had cast him out, and he found him. Does this sound like Jesus? Right? Those who are outsiders, those who are outcasts, Jesus seeks them like the shepherd who seeks out the one sheep. You know that the next chapter is talking about Jesus saying, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep and my sheep know me and they follow my voice. there's not a chapter break. This all fits together. So he found him and then said, do you believe? And of course, this is where we get the man who finally comes to this place of worshiping and believing. The other verdict then is the verdict toward the Jewish leaders, in this case the Pharisees, where Jesus says they're actually blind. And I actually think, as weird as it is, the point of the story are these two verdicts. That this man who is accused of being blind because of sin, his sin or his parents' sin, actually is the one who sees because of Jesus. And the ones who claim to see and have no sin, or have self-righteousness, actually are blind and don't see at all. The ones who feel like they have the power to cast out are actually the ones who are going to be cast out. And the one who is cast out is actually brought in. John chapter 9 is a paradigm of discipleship, a paradigm that says, who are you in this story? Now, I love stories, at night I'll go put my kids to bed much more, when they were younger, and I'd be like, want me to tell you a story? And I don't always do this. I'm not always a good dad, so don't let me lie to you. But when I would say, let me tell you a story, okay, you know what happened. My kids would be like, yeah, we'd tell Jesus stories, right? We'd tell stories. Or I would be like, there was a girl and a dragon, and my daughter would be like, no, right? We tell a story. Stories have the ability to put you in I'm going to call it like the cockpit of the flight simulator. And you actually, the way God has created you, Michael DeFazio did his PhD on this, by the way. You actually, as the reader, the hearer, have mirror neurons. The way God's created your brain is that you sense some of the same things going on for the person who's the lead in the story. So if it's the Hobbit, and Samwise Gamgee, raises him up and like, I'm your friend. Like you either are Frodo or you're Sam in the story, and those mirror neurons are making you all the emotions, right, in the story. And so God has created us this way that stories cause us to enter into the story and experience the story. And so my question for you in this story would be like, so who does God want you to resonate with and go, oh, that's me in the story? Maybe it is the blind man. Where God wants to use your trials and tribulations, your pain, whether it's caused by you or not, caused by your sin or not, caused by family sin or not, he wants to use it to bring glory to Jesus and to bring light and to bring sight to you, to bring faith. But you might also be the Pharisees, and he goes, hey, we need to have an honest conversation. And in John's gospel, you're either one of those two. And either one, he still wants to bring you to a place of belief. If you're a Pharisee, he wants to bring you to a place of repentance. And Jesus wanted that for the Pharisees. I truly, truly believe that. He was speaking the truth to them so that some of them might repent. Some of them did. Okay, so we have Nicodemus, who's kind of hanging on, by the way, kind of just trailing along in this story, and we have some questions about him. So notice that dynamic as it plays out. Any other questions you have about this story of the man born blind? I know we kind of moved through that last couple paragraphs rather quickly. Any other questions or comments that come to mind out of this story? I know that's always one of those. Yeah.
I don't know if it's really related. When they were in captivity in Egypt, the first 4 or 5 plagues, the Magi were able to duplicate.
Yeah.
Was there any recordings of any Magi still that could do anything?
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the things that's true of Israel as they go into places like Egypt, but also experiences in Babylon and Persia, is they're always magicians claiming to or spiritually able to do miracles, and sometimes they'd be limited, and sometimes they'd be overshadowed by God's miracles. So this is where Jesus would even say, hey, even if I did these miracles in front of you, not all of you would believe. Some of the accusations against Jesus is that he's doing them by the power of whom? He's doing them by the power of Beelzebub, which is just a mocking name of Satan. It's the Lord of the Flies, which means the Lord of the garbage heaps. It's making fun of the god Baal, okay, Lord of the Flies or Lord of the House, and adding this idea of like, yeah, he's the god of the garbage heap. And the mockery is of Jesus, you're doing this by the power of Satan/demons. And so character assassination is what they were doing, but they're associating him with those who would be either charlatans or spiritually actually doing things by the power of evil powers. By the way, in Haiti and other worldviews, this is just like taken for granted that spirits can cause you to be able to do supernatural, what we would call outside of the natural world things. And so, yeah, test the spirits, John says. Okay, good. Well, let's move into John 10 then. Let's move into this section on the shepherd. I think that you all recognize, again, this metaphor of shepherding and sheep is a pretty common one. We talk a bit about how sheep are dumb. It's kind of a common thing to joke about. It's right. It's true. And so we're going to talk about a few stories. One of the things I want you to hear in this passage is that, once again, we have an I am statement that's going to take place. So these have happened rather recently in our study. I am the bread of life. And then in the Feast of Tabernacles, I'm the light of the world. Now 2 of them. I'm the gate for sheep, and I'm the good shepherd for sheep. These 2 entrances. Of course, then with the story of Lazarus in the next chapter, I am the resurrection and the life. So these statements that will add up to the number 7 continue to be a theme. So Jesus starts into this particular text. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the front door, but who climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens, and the sheep will hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. And we'll continue to kind of open up this particular theme. But I want you to see that we just had this story of this man that Jesus finds and brings in, even though he was kicked out of the flock. And so one time I did a social experiment. As a preacher, especially at youth camps, sometimes I can carry out experiments on students. And I do this in the classroom too at times. And so let me tell you one of my social experiments on this text. Crowd of 2,000 people. We're in the Valley of Colorado. You were probably there. We're in the Valley of Colorado. We have 2,000 campers. Adult sponsors are with them. They're from all over the country. Most of them Missouri, Iowa, though. Most of them our people. And so I'm preaching on this text. In the process of preaching on this text, what I thought I would do is help them to recognize how important it is to know the voice of Jesus. And that if you know the voice of Jesus, how readily you can recognize that voice and then respond to that voice. So here's where the experiment went. I asked a sponsor from one of the churches that had about 50 kids in their church to record himself reading Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And so he just read it, and I recorded it. Then in this valley, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me beside still waters, green pastures. We're in a green pasture. I play over the loudspeakers, open air amphitheater, this voice of this individual reading this passage. And I ask the students, if and when you recognize this voice, I want you to stand up. Now, I didn't know how this would go. This is how it happens sometimes as a preacher. You're like, I hope this works, Jesus. I hope this works. And so as soon as this voice, though, not even a full word gets out, and a student stands up. Couple words, first verse, couple more students, and then of course then it's crowd mentality. Everyone's like, oh, if they're standing up, I should stand up too. But most of them understood. So 50 students kind of just standing up. They know this sponsor's voice. And then from other groups, a few people did as well. Notice that the familiarity relationally to this individual caused them to recognize his voice. I don't know if that should say anything about how close we should get to Jesus relationally. You want to know the student who stood up first? His child. Makes sense, doesn't it? Moms, did you know this? Babies in the womb know your voice. Scientifically proven. It's pretty amazing, the power that God has given us to recognize voices, isn't it? I can be in a crowd, on a Sunday morning, in the lobby, right? And I can hear, Dad! Now, that's not to say I always get it right. But I often get it right, and I know that it's my kid out of all the kids running around on Sunday morning. It's pretty amazing. Now, my kids in church, if they get in trouble, growing up, if, mom was like, hey, across the room, I knew it was me. She's talking to me. So we have this created in us, this dynamic that says, this voice recognition software. We're not a computer, but God has created us that way to recognize voices. And so here we have this theme of this good shepherd. Now, I need you to see a couple things about this, okay? So background of shepherding sheep. Shepherds, 100 times in the Bible. It's just a random fact, but it's a pretty pervasive theme, okay? Sheep, 400 times in the Bible. Sheep are all over the place. Shepherds are all over the place. I need you to hear this. Ancient flocks were 10,000 to 100,000 strong. This was the major industry in the ancient world. Okay, we think of car manufacturing. Theirs was raising sheep and goats. Okay, so this is a really important thing. For those of you who are in agriculture, you recognize this dynamic. It is a major industry in the ancient world. This is why sometimes I struggle with when we call ministry pastoring, and by pastoring mean only like one-on-one or one-on-small group ministry. Because pastoring is the Latin word for the word shepherding. That's what the word pastor means, just shepherd. That's all it means. Not actually a title, by the way. It just means they lead like the shepherd. That's all it means. They shepherd people. But I need you to see that the metaphor of shepherding in the ancient world, the way they would have understood it, is yes, a shepherd is over one sheep. Jesus just did that with the blind man. And yes, shepherds have small flocks, the shepherds who are out at night, perhaps in Christmas story. But you also had the industry of shepherd where you might have a flock of 100,000. So guess what Peter says? Jesus is the chief shepherd, elders, you're the shepherds, and we shepherd the sheep. There are layers of shepherding. I just need you to hear that because some of you have the picture. It's not bad. Don't take it down. But the picture from the 1970s of Jesus with a sheep over his shoulders. He is pale complected, but hey, there's that. And so it's this only image we have of Jesus as a shepherd is him with one. And they would have seen this as much more complex than that. Why do I say that? Because it became a metaphor, not just in Israel, but in the ancient world, of leadership. Kings, you kind of picture Pharaoh, maybe his coffin, his sarcophagus, right? Pharaoh, that Pharaoh. And he has what in his hand? A shepherding staff at times, and a rod and a staff. Those are shepherding tools. Right? So Pharaoh is depicted as a shepherd, and other ancient kings are oftentimes depicted as shepherds. God, of course, then, is also depicted as shepherds. I've given you a number of passages. We're not going to look up all of them. If you ever want to do a Bible study on the theme of shepherding, I went ahead and gave those to you there. But that theme of shepherding runs all the way through the Bible. You have it in Abraham, you have it in Moses, you have it in David, you have it in Amos, you have it in Jesus' Christmas story. You have shepherding all the way throughout. And then Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. He's kind of saying something in that moment, just going to tell you. To say, I'm the good one, I'm the one, it's again, not only a kingly Messiah claim, not only a relational claim, but also a divine claim, and I want us to picture that. Now, in the church, this is the label that says healthy shepherds in the church. Shepherds in the church, typically what I would use is the word shepherd or pastor to describe not only the person who would be like the senior minister, the pastor, or pastors in the church, staff members who shepherd. In the early church, the elders, the fathers of the church, were often pastors of the church as well. And then we were all called to pastor the flocks under us as well. So in a way, you're all pastors, not in the modern way that we use the word, but you're all shepherds. I have a small flock at home, 3 kids, wife. I shepherd them. I have students at work and coworkers at work. I'm their supervisor. I'm their shepherd. I'm a pastor at work. Even if it was a non-Christian or secular environment, I'm a pastor at work. And of course, then pastor here, getting ready to go to an elders meeting tonight at 8:15. So I want us to recognize that word. That word pastor is just Latin for the word shepherd. I've given you a number of passages. Some of them I've alluded to talk about those who are called pastors in the church. Church leadership, okay, is not about power, but about responsibility. Family leadership is not about power, but about responsibility. Can I say this again? Christian leadership, notice how I'm generalizing now, is not about power, or it's about responsibility, and influence is not about power over, but power to transform, right? A cause for transformation. So even when it comes to church titles, this is maybe a sidebar, church titles, things like the word elder, overseer, minister, which is just the word servant, that's all that is, it's Latin, it's the word servant. Those are just titles of responsibility. It's kind of like the title dad. When I say to my kids, I'm the dad, is it a title of power? I mean, they might see it that way, but you know this, it's actually just, it's a title of responsibility. It's actually, in many ways, a sacrifice or a burden if you do it right, if you do it God's way. Same thing with mom. Right? It's a sacrifice. It's a title of responsibility. And so they would have seen titles in the church that way, that we are there to give ourselves, to surrender ourselves, to serve, and to lead the flock as they lead toward Jesus. Now, that being said, then one of the things we see is there's a number of warnings in the Bible. I'm saying kind of all of that to say this. There's a number of warnings in the Bible against unhealthy shepherds. And the one that I want you to pay attention to the most, maybe in your own reading, is Ezekiel 34. Ezekiel 34 is an entire chapter against the unhealthy leaders of Israel, who lead for their own motivations and their own selfishness. So when Jesus stands up and you have these leaders who just kicked a guy out, and he brings him in, when he turns around and says, I'm the good shepherd, in the background of Israel's history is also this indictment, the verdict that's still hanging in the air, that says, and they're not the legitimate shepherds. I'm the good shepherd. I shepherd like the Father, and they're not shepherding like the Father. And Ezekiel 34 is this indictment. Now, you can go to Jeremiah and these other passages as well. It's all there. Matthew 23, same thing. Woe to you. You do this for your own purposes, for your own greed, for your own titles, for your own platforms and reputations. So maybe this is one of those things we should take to heart. Is it possible to lead in a way that is selfish? Sure it is. Now can I label some places where you pastor? In your family, your marriage, with your kids, in your workplace, in your church, in your community. Are you healthy shepherds? Or do you listen to the voice of the good shepherd? Remember the hierarchy of the sheep, big flock. Chief shepherd, you're not him, by the way. So we shepherd like him because we listen to his voice and we care about the flock the same. He lays his life down for the flock. Right? So we shepherd like him. This indictment and this theme plays throughout. Now, Mark obviously dealt with this passage in a number of other ways, so I've kind of tried to take this other approach, looking at kind of the negative side of the warning. Now, let me give you a couple stories, and then we can dabble a little bit in the last part of chapter 10. There's a story, not too recently, I think it was probably 2020, 2021, right in that time. I think 2020. I think it happened during the same year as COVID, which is funny how these stories lined up. But there's a story, not here in the United States, of a ship that is at port. Can I go there with me? Okay, sounds like a parable. There's a certain boat that was parked at a dock. Shipping containers were loaded on. Agricultural shipping containers were loaded on with sheep. I believe the number is 10,000 sheep. I'm going to take it back on and look at the newspaper. 10,000 sheep loaded onto the ship. It was overloaded. So the shipping containers, the agricultural shipping containers, were stacked too high, too heavy, and while the boat is at the dock at port, it capsizes, tips over. So 10,000 sheep are now in the water. Only like 100 of them lived. So it was not only an economic disaster, it was also a biohazard that happened in the water. Now, there's, like, if you look this up, and I think like the BBC, some of the UK's and newspapers carried this story. If you look it up, it's actually kind of sad because you actually have this picture of like one of the few living sheep being pulled out of the water, waterlogged, and being pulled out. And it's just like, oh. Then when you read the story a little bit further, you find out the reason why this ship was overloaded is because of greed. Those who were shepherds of these sheep were selling them and didn't want to pay the extra shipping to have two separate shipments, so overloaded the boat. Now you might go, well, they lost a lot of money. They got what they deserved. Jesus would go, man, did you notice the sheep and how much they suffered because of the greed of the shepherds? We live in a world, whether it's business, whether it's family, whether it's churches at times, or the Christian community, that at times because of the lack of health of shepherds, the sheep suffer. And Jesus comes along and says, I'm the model of good shepherding. I'm the model of what it looks like to be a good leader. And so it's not just John 10, it's Jesus' life as a servant leader, sacrificial leader, that becomes this model that we mimic. I am the good shepherd. Okay, so follow the good shepherd, listen to his voice, and be a good shepherd like him. And so also then go listen to Mark Christian's sermon on this passage. So with that then, verse 19, notice there was again division amongst the Jews because of these words. And so some of them are saying he's insane, he has a demon. They're saying these things about him. Okay. Notice, can a demon open the eyes of the blind man? That's still in the background. Then we come to verse 22. And in verse 22, I need you to see in your Bible that we have a calendar, flip of the calendar. How many of you still have paper calendars? I'm actually just curious. Okay, because this is a social experiment. Oh, there was even some younger people who have paper calendars. I'm proud of some of you. So this is one of those stereotypes that's easy to make, right? And I use this metaphor often. But when it comes to the flipping of the calendar, we actually have a date change. Feast of Tabernacles, fall. Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah. This is familiar to you, okay? This is one of the holidays you go, oh, I know when this is in the calendar. My question would be for you, we don't always know this, so what does the Feast of Hanukkah celebrate? Okay, and if you don't know, that's okay. It's the Feast of Dedication, Feast of Lights, Festival of Lights. Here's what it celebrates. It's not in the Old Testament. Why? Because the story it celebrates wasn't in the Old Testament. It happened 167 BC. The last of the Old Testament is 400 BC. And then we have a period of time of about 400 years. Now, that's a rough number, but about 400 years of what maybe we call silence. And scholars call it, throughout church history, we've called it the intertestamental period. Why have we called it that? Because it's between the two testaments. That's it. There's not really this huge high church reason for that. Just it's between the two testaments or the two covenants. So 400 years in between. Midway through that, 167, so roughly 167, roughly midway through, that Israel was overthrown by the Greeks. The guy named Alexander the Great. Okay, now his empire expanded. Israel was one of the places they took over. Roll that tape forward. Alexander the Great dies. Now there's multiple kings ruling over all of the remnants of his kingdoms. And there's another guy who comes in. His name is Antiochus Antiochus Epiphanes, which means God manifested. He thought he was God, like a lot of leaders do. And so Antiochus Epiphanes IV rolls into town, and he goes, hey, this Jewish tradition, this can't go. They need Greek culture here. Alexander the Great, Greek culture, called Hellenism, Greek culture, 167. So I'm condensing this down to one date just to keep reinforcing it. It happens kind of over a period of time. Antiochus Epiphanes goes into the temple. Sets up, rather than to the altar to God, Yahweh, sets up an altar there and sacrifices pigs on that. Not very popular if you're Jewish to sacrifice pigs in the temple, just saying, okay? Yeah, I'll leave it there. So when it comes to this, there's also human tragedy that happens. There's stories of again, rape and the killing of people who are trying to be faithful. They burn Torah scrolls, Old Testament scrolls, the Hebrew Bible. They burn the Hebrew Bible. They tell moms they can't sacrifice their boys, or not sacrifice, can't circumcise their boys. And if they find out that boys have been circumcised, they hang them. The 9-year-old or 9-day-old boy. So think about this time period. Okay. So with some of this, there's also stories. You can read this in 1 Maccabees, by the way, which is a story of this period of time. There's also stories of entire families deciding, a mom with her sons who are giving their life to be faithful because they're not going to eat the pork, they're not going to burn the scrolls, they're not going to do this. So one after one, she sees all of her boys executed in front of her, and she actually goes, don't just be faithful, and then she dies as well. So this is that period of time, 167. The Maccabean family is a Jewish family. So Matthias Maccabeus, okay, that's a cool name. He is actually kind of the godfather of this family. His son, Judas Maccabeus, becomes kind of the warrior of the family. That's why the name Judas is really popular. Do you know another Judas? I wonder, we're going to ask this question when we get to Judas Iscariot. What was his mom thinking when he called him Judas? Maybe Old Testament tribe of Judah, kingly tribe? But maybe Judas Maccabeus, the war hero who brings freedom. This is why in The Chosen, Judas's motivation is maybe to manipulate Jesus to military action. I think that's where they're going with this new season. That's one theory about him. I think he's just greedy. But Judas Maccabeus, Matthias, they actually come in, they overthrow Antiochus, they overthrow the Greek armies at this particular time. They reestablish the kingdom of Israel, the uniqueness of Israel, and it's called the Hasmonean dynasty, the kingship that takes place that leads us really up to kind of the time of Rome, where they kind of hand the keys over to Rome, and Rome actually just comes in and does the same thing. So now we're living with Rome in the New Testament period. The reason I need you to know that is this holiday celebrates when the kingly family, the Maccabean family, goes into the temple and cleanses it out and rededicates it. So they clean out all of the paganism, all of the defilement, and they reestablish the menorah. They relight the menorah. And there's worship again that's kosher, that's ordained worship. This is what's that celebrated, the dedication or rededication of the temple. And so we have that takes place here. Now, I always find it somewhat intriguing that you have Jesus who's going to come in and he is actually going to be the one who is now the temple. And I don't know that that's what's going on in this passage, but anytime you come to temple, just understand that there's a lot of layers going on with that particular dynamic. Now, in this particular text, you'll notice Jesus continues this theme of trial. Why? Because division has been growing and division has been continuing. Schism has been continuing. And so you see the theme of light in the temple and my sheep know my voice. You see some of those themes. I need you to go down to verse 31. Chapter 10, verse 31, like chapter 8, verse 59. They picked up stones again to stone Jesus. And Jesus says, okay, so what have I done to cause this verdict? And they basically said, because you have made yourself out to be God. Now, Jesus in this passage quotes from a psalm. To be honest, sometimes we miss what he's doing out of Psalm 82. I think what Jesus is doing is he's talking about them as their role as leaders who are supposed to be judges. They're supposed to judge justly, but they're not judging justly. They're supposed to represent God as his sons. The Psalms uses the idea of a heavenly court, and they're there in the heavenly court. They're supposed to render justice, but they don't. So I want to read Psalm 82 because when Jesus quotes it, I think he actually alludes to the entire psalm. And what I need you to hear, like the story of the blind man, this story ends with Jesus saying that they are guilty because they're not the leaders God has called them to be. They're not just the way that God has called them to be. So Psalm 82, it's at the end of your handout. God has taken his place in the divided council. In the midst of the gods, he holds his judgment. Now, I need you to know this is imagery. This is a song. This is poetic. It's imagery. And it's using imagery from the ancient world. So not always can you take songs or even at times some of the parables and go, well, this is exactly how our structure is of heaven. This is imagery of how they would have understood it. And in the ancient world, earthly kings would have been under the throne of God representatives of his justice. Shepherds, like we've already talked about. Shepherds under the shepherd. So you have this court that's being taken place. However, you notice rather quickly that those who are supposed to be holding judgment are not doing it justly. Verse 2, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Pause, Selah. Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. Does this remind you of a story we've just talked about? All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall all die. Fall like any prince. Arise, O God, and judge the earth, for you shall inherit the nations. I think two things are going on here. Number one, when Jesus alludes to Psalm 82, he's saying, you all are guilty. You're supposed to be the leaders of God's people. And you're doing this. You're going to stone me, and I'm innocent. You're not just. The second thing he's doing is I think Jesus does this often where he'll speak a truth, and they won't exactly know what to do with it. You remember how Jesus does this? When they ask a question, he'll respond, and they'll be like, I don't know what to do with that. Should we give taxes to Caesar or not? I don't know. Give to Caesar what is Caesar. Give to God what is God's. What does that mean? Well, on the coin is a picture of a guy who has the image of God. So sure, give it to Caesar, but guess what? The image of Caesar is an image of God, therefore it's God's. See what he did? He kind of answered the question in a way that didn't cause him legal trouble. He's genius. This is one of those genius passages. in quoting this psalm, he, number one, says, you're guilty of Psalm 82. Number two, he's like, Psalm 82 in its imagery talks about the fact that we're gods in kind of a lesser form symbolic image. There's other places where Jesus clearly claims to be God. But in this kind of psalm quote, they're like, well, we can't really nail him to the, well, maybe that's a bad metaphor to say. We can't really legally bring this up against him because he has legal grounds right here. Jesus is a genius lawyer. Well, he's like the judge. So he knows how this works, and he knows how they work. And I want you to hear this when it comes to this particular story at this particular time. We are now just 3 months. 3 months from the trial of Jesus. They tried to stone him multiple times now. He's either gotten away or, hidden away or sovereignly been able to get away. Sometimes you're like, I don't know how he got out of that. But when his time in John's gospel comes, his hour is going to come. It's going to be on his terms. And so I want us to recognize we're coming to that end. That John 11 is the tipping point. And kind of like, the movie Tombstone, kind of those movies where like, this is it, like it's going to happen. John 11 is that. To where we go, where this is getting so intense, we're coming to the final conflict. And so that's where we end tonight. What we'll discover is Jesus leaves the region of Judea, Jerusalem, and he goes back out. We're going to pick up there, kind of the end of John 10, when we get back together. Because it's going to be really important to recognize how long does Jesus wait, and why does he wait when his friend is sick. That's where we'll pick